All right. Well, welcome everyone back to my little USF football show. I'm your host, Chad Birger. I've been doing this for about a week and a half now, talking about USF football, inviting some guests on. It's pretty fun. I enjoy doing it. So tonight, our guest is Dan Genzler. Dan is the sports information director at the University of Sioux Falls. And so, Dan, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, everyone, welcome. This is going to be a great show. Like the previous ones have been. It's really interesting to get to talk about USF football with all of you chiming in on chat and everything else. I've been with USF since 2014. I probably followed the University of Sioux Falls previous to that. I go back to 2009, 2008. Those great teams. I remember sitting in Vermillion when I was working at the University of South Dakota, thinking about the 2009 game when they were going to play North Dakota. I didn't think they had much of a shot. Boy, I was way wrong about that one. Sioux Falls dominated that game, and it just continued this long legacy of great USF football. So I enjoy being here. This is a great university to be part of. Great sports, great academics, great people to work with. So I enjoyed it. And I think tonight we're gonna have some fun with this. Records may not seem on the top of things to be. There's really some interesting ones and maybe a little controversy here. So we'll see.
Yeah. All right. Well, tonight, like you mentioned, we're going to talk about some all-time records with USF football. And so, I picked who I thought was the perfect guest for this one. I kind of saved this one for you, Dan.
Right.
Because I know you're all about records. When I used to do stats, help out with stats at the home games, I would always tease Dan and be like, "Hey, that's the most the most pass completions in one single play or something." Always tease him about records as they were happening.
I think Chad's a sports info junkie because post game he often brings guests up to help me out when we're having them talk to Tom Frederick and Tim Hyatt. So I appreciate you, Chad, and this will be fun.
Yeah. So tonight, what we're going to do a top 10 list, kind of like we did the first few shows. We're going to talk about the top 10 records in USF history, and with those top 10 records, it's not necessarily it's kind of a hodgepodge. I posted to Dan as pick the 10 records you think are least likely to be broken anytime soon. And so that's kind of the premise that we're going with tonight, is kind of that most impressive record, or the records that are least likely to be broken. And so, usually I kind of got drilled on my first show, Dan, because I did my top 10 list and I just went 1 through 10 and everyone was just absolutely demolishing me because I didn't go 10 to 1. So I learned my lesson. So before we get to number 10, there were a few records that probably didn't make your top 10. And so I kind of call those the honorable mention records. What do you have as your honorable mention records of all time for USF football, Dan?
There's really some really interesting ones. Hall of Famer Darren Martina, 59 tackles for loss from 2000 to 02. That's certainly one of them. Here's an interesting one. 511 points scored in first half of games by 2019. They averaged 34 points a game. A couple other ones.
In the first half, you said?
First half. Half. John Ryan. Well, when you're dealing with stats, guys, you know what you're dealing with. John Ryan, I can't believe he didn't make it with his single season receiving yards, but 1430 is right on the edge there, and it's certainly worthy of top 10. There's just some real tough ones to go through. A few others. Bob Gary has a record that won't be broken. He had a 99-yard interception return in 1972. A couple older records. Pass defense in 1960 allowed 552 points. Bob Young was on that team, and Reed Beyer, I believe. Total defense in 1967, they allowed 1,275 yards, and in 9 games when they went 7-2. And then one here that I ran across today, Chad Cavender, 67.3% completion mark over a 2-year period. He threw for over 7,000 yards and threw 739 passes, but nearly 64 TDs, but 67% is amazing. And one final one, Curtis Riggs, 3,993 pass yards in 1996. Again, that's one that's really, it's 300 yards more than anybody's had since that time. And so that's certainly another one worthy of mention.
Yeah, that offense in '96 was spectacular. I wanted to go back real quick. So you said in the 1960 team, you said they allowed 550 yards?
52, yeah, 552 yards in pass defense. I might not have said
yeah.
pass defense. So
obviously, that's a really great mark, but I don't think the aerial attacks were as great in 1960 as they are in the modern game. So that's probably a reason that made the honorable mention. You also mentioned with that 67 defense, they only played 9 games back then. And so I think that's why maybe some of the teams we're going to talk about here might have an advantage because, playing more games during that stretch makes some of these numbers a little bit more impressive.
Now that 67 defense was a great defense. It certainly, and they'll be mentioned as we go through this again. So keep your eye on that.
I did not attend any games in 1967. I had not been born at that point, but I'll take your word for it.
A few of us were alive at that point. A few of us.
I had one here that I hope never gets broken, and I bring this one up all the time. But in 1985, Al Hansen had 12 punts in one game. It was against Doane College, and so he's still a USF record holder for most punts in a single game. If you ever want to have a good time, a good story, ask Coach Hansen about that game because he loves to tell that story about how he had 12 punts in a single game.
Since we're talking about punts, we ought to talk about Trevor Holloman. He's another one that made an honorable mention list. 6 block kicks in his career is pretty amazing. And so Al was punting them and Trevor was blocking them, right? That's any kick, of course, field goals and so on.
So those are, I think, some pretty decent records that we've seen throughout the years of USF football. So I think we can go ahead and dive right into our top 10s. In the past, we've kind of gone alternating. So I'll give my number 10, and then I'll let you do number 10 and number 9. And then we'll kind of, snake our way down to number 1 to see if we have agreement or disagreement or how it goes. But my number 10 is the touchdown receptions in a season. And that touchdown receptions in a season was by John Ryan in 2010, and it was 24, which I think second place was Dusty Haborka maybe at 19. Does that sound right?
That's right.
So
that is.
Yeah, so it was a pretty decent mark. 24 touchdown catches in a single season is just spectacular. I had a tough time going against that one, and so did a lot of other people. He ended up winning National Player of the Year that year. So it's obviously a great season and a great accomplishment for John Ryan.
Yeah, the Watertown kid that was the year he had 1,430 yards receiving, and that was a great team in 2010 for sure.
Yeah. All right.
So I'm going to jump.
Ahead.
My number 10 is Lorenzo Brown, who ranks as one of the great all-time quarterbacks in school history for sure. Top 5, top 3, probably top 2 in some people's books. He had 56 combined TDs in 2009. Just a couple things on his notes. He threw for 3,000 yards. He rushed for 844. He had 16 rushing touchdowns, 40 passing touchdowns versus 6 interceptions, and over 4,000 yards in total offense, which interestingly is another mark that should be mentioned in terms of honorable mention because it didn't make my top 10. But that's incredible performance by Lo Brown.
And he was probably only playing the first half of most of those games.
That was an incredible team. They certainly scored up, and they were going up and down the field all the time. And as we'll talk about them again throughout the course. You know, at number 9, when you go through these top 10s, you come across some incredible numbers. And so I don't know that if you go 1 through 9 or 10 through 1, which one's right, because I'm not so sure some of these shouldn't warrant being number 1 that are back here at 8, 9, 7, and 10.
Yeah.
And so Dusty Havorka, he has 2 marks here that I kind of put together in one. He had 4,801 receiving yards in his career. Let's to really put a reflection on that. That's 1,339 yards over the number 2 guy, which is John Ryan again at 3,462. Dusty played on that championship team in 2006, and certainly he's had an impact in coaching. He had 291 receptions and 55 touchdown receptions. I don't even think arguably. I think he's the greatest receiver in school history.
Yeah. I'm with you there. So how about number 9?
That was number 9. Brown was 10, and Dusty's receiving marks were number 9.
Gotcha. I need to update my telestrator here.
All right.
So my number 9, this one was a tough one. I had it started off in my honorable mention, and I was like, God, this is just, the more I think about it, the more impressive it is. It was the 2018 season for Gabe Watson, 1,991 yards rushing. So Gabe had a tremendous year that year rushing. One of the reasons why it's not probably higher on my list, it's by the way, it's like I think over 200 yards ahead of the second place season in USF single season history, which was Max Mickey a couple years before that. But one of the reasons why it's probably not higher is, if Gabe ends up playing again this next year, he could potentially beat that again, or there's a possibility that it could happen. We could see a 2,000-yard rusher here in the near future. So that's
177 yards a game. Led to D2. I didn't have it in there because I expected him to better his second year coming up. So we talk about reachable records with him and that offensive line, and that offense certainly has the opportunity to do that again.
Yeah. My number 8 team or 8 record here, and I know Dan's going to give lots more stats later on this one, but it was the defensive rushing totals from the 2008 season. I think total they ended up, you said there was one team that was maybe ahead of them or gave up fewer yards than them throughout USF history, but that team had only played a few 9 games or whatever it was. So this team ended up going to the championship and winning. Total defensive domination from that 2008 squad. Even in the championship game, you saw 2 defensive touchdowns from that team. So a spectacular year. There was one game during that season where the opponent had finished the game with negative 43 yards rushing on 15 carries or something like that. So, I mean, how would you like to go back and look at the stats on Monday after that game where you averaged negative 3 yards per carry for the entire game? That is absolutely insane.
I believe it was Northwestern, and I believe that was, I don't remember if it was 41 or 43, but when that game was played, it was certainly expectation that was going to be a battle, and that defense just dominated. I have them higher on my list, and so once we get to that point, we can break out that season because there's some really incredible numbers that need to be talked about. So we'll just keep our audience on hold on that one.
All right. Well, go ahead and give us your number 8 and then your number 7 here, Dan.
Yeah, I've got 12-time All-American Solomon St. Pierre at number 8. I came across his yesterday in a conversation with somebody else I was talking to, and Matt Witwicky, who you've had on, and I came across 521 interception return yards. in context against the next closest one, Mike Hockett, who had 264, that number seems virtually untouchable. Here's a guy from Wagner, South Dakota, that certainly was part of two great playoff teams. Actually, one playoff team and a team that went to a bowl game in 2014. And he had 22 career interceptions. He tied the school record with 10 in 2015. That's, it's incredible too. Another number about him, he had 6 interception returns for a touchdown. Mike Hockett had 5. So he certainly is somebody that I think that's a number that's incredible. Number 7, we're going to go to back the kickers. Here we go. At number 7, Braden Vikings, 162 straight extra points. And that included making 100 of 101 in 2009. Interestingly, in 2009, he missed the very first extra point of the season, the first touchdown they scored against Nebraska Wesleyan in September. And he didn't miss again until the following year at Northwest Oklahoma State, a 33-19 win when he missed in the third quarter, 162 in a row.
And that got blocked too.
Yeah, that's right. He didn't actually miss it. It was blocked.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And that game was freezing cold, if I remember correctly. My dad and I were just trying to stay warm during that game. That was an incredibly cold game. And so I imagine kicking that football was probably about like kicking a cement block.
He's certainly, and I don't know if it's arguable. He's probably the top kicker in USF football history. I mean, he had a 54-yard field goal. He's the all-time leader in field goals and points. And so, yeah, he's certainly worthy of that spot.
Well, I put him there on my all-time team as the top kicker in USF history in the previous show, and I never had – my phone wasn't blowing up with controversy about that call. I was expecting Aaron Beavers or someone from the olden days to give me a text or call after that one, but I didn't get any feedback on that one. So the jury out there must approve. So before I get into my number 7 record of all time, I did want to mention, if you guys want to join the live chat on YouTube, please do. If you send in some notes for us, we can answer some of those questions on the air. And so we had one come in, and I wanted to lighten up the mood here a little bit and show this one. But our friend Tony, who does stats at home games, wanted to know for the most touchdowns scored in one play. Dan, I don't know if you have official record on that.
That's an all-timer. It can't ever be broken.
And then the most wings eaten at halftime. Do you know who the record holder is for that?
Well, it's got to be you, Chad. I mean, I certainly have seen my share of wings devourment during pregame, and now, since you're on the sideline, it's usually at halftime. So you're burning with that passion when you go back down to the field.
Usually when new people come up to the press box, I kind of let them know, if you want wings, you better get them before halftime, because if there's any left at halftime, I'm finishing them off. So hopefully everyone kind of knows the drill by now.
Right.
I don't remember official totals there, Tony, but I'm sure I'm going to get tweeted a picture later on tonight with me eating wings from the back there.
Maybe we ought to get him to send in the number that he's seen you eat. I know there's certainly some pictures out there of that's been placed on Twitter of and you may have a following. Maybe we start a wings Twitter account for you. I don't know.
Oh, well, let's get back into some of these most impressive stats. I've got my number 7 stat here, and that was the most offensive touchdowns in one season. 92 scored in 2009. That 2009 team, I think they had a little bit of an advantage because they played 15 games that season. So, obviously they had an advantage there. But you mentioned earlier, with Braden kicking 100 extra points that year, they had to score a heck of a lot of touchdowns to do that, and most of them were through the offense. Lorenzo Brown was a spectacular leader that year, and had quite a hand in a lot of those. And then, Low Miller was a running back and scored quite a few that season. And so there was just a lot of great guys on that squad and a lot of touchdowns scored. And so that's my number 7.
Well, to go along with that point, they scored 50 rushing and 42 passing that season. And then they had 13 more touchdowns during the course of the year that weren't on offense, 105 total that year, according to the stats that I looked at tonight.
Yeah, that's absolutely insane. My number 6 most impressive stat in USF history is the offensive total yards. And so I had Luke Papillion during his 4-year career from 2013 to 2016 had 9,106 passing yards and 3,383 rushing yards for a total of 12,489. And, I played with a guy, Dax Michelena, who finished with just over 10,000 in the 2001 season, and that was a really impressive feat. And so for someone to get 12,000, I think that's very, very impressive. And just to kind of put that into perspective, if someone were to play for 4 seasons at USF, they would have to average over 3,100 yards per season, both combined passing and rushing, in order to do that. And I think the rushing is kind of what sets this up on the next level as far as what Luke did during his career at USF.
Yeah, I've got him on my top 5, so we'll get into him and add a few more facts to what you had just brought forward.
Perfect. All right. Well, those are my 2. So you want to give number 6 and number 5 here?
Yeah. Number 6 is David Reuter, 85 total touchdowns. He had 73 rushing from 1995 to 98. Another Hall of Famer. Certainly he is one of the most impactful players and greatest running backs in school history. He had 4,783 rushing yards, 7.1 a carry. Only back in school history to rush for 300 yards twice. And one of those times was in the playoffs. And he also, to go along with that, 85 total touchdowns, he had 518 points, which is part of this mark too. And he was the 3rd player at any level to reach that mark, in which he set an NAIA record. Incredible total, 85 total touchdowns. Watson had 26 rushing touchdowns a year ago, and that didn't even break the school mark because Reuter had 29 in 98, I believe it was. Yep. So certainly, that mark is, it's at 6, but it could easily be higher. It's incredible. But he was an incredible player from a small town in South Dakota.
Irene, South Dakota, 1993 Joe Robbie Award winner for the state championship Cardinals.
You're not as young as you say you are.
Well, I will say this. I played with David Reuter, and I actually blocked for him during that 1998 season. So I'm not trying to say that I had anything to do with that record, but I will, just throw that out there, that I was part of the offensive line for that 1998 record that you just mentioned.
Is that account for his 4 or 5 times he had a loss on carry?
Oh, man. All right.
I just made that up. There's no truth to that. Number 5, you just mentioned him, Luke Papillion. His number, 12,480 yards in total offense for a career, is unbelievable. And when he was going through it, we were having some incredible fun with this because Luke Papillion at 6'4", 225 and could run around 4.5 40 was one of the most impressive athletes in school history. He had 120 total TDs in his career, including 79 passing. And when you think about that, he led his team to 38 wins in 4 seasons. And that was his freshman year. They went 6-5, and he missed part of that year. He is one of 3 quarterbacks in NCAA Division II history to have 9,000 yards passing and 3,000 yards rushing. The other 2 are also from the NSIC. Drew Bauer of Minnesota Duluth and James McNear, who was the first one to do quite a few years ago from Concordia St. Paul. So, yeah, I mean, Luke was a phenomenal player. He did his total on 1,764 plays, which is over 7 yards a play. One of the truly, and not only that, but Luke was such a phenomenal leader, just like David Reuter and Curtis Riggs and many others, DeBoer. I mean, we have great leadership on our football legacy here at University of Sioux Falls.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. All right. I'm into my top 5 now, and I think I'm going to start repeating some of the ones that you just gave. So this is where, Dan and I, we didn't plan ahead. We didn't compare lists at a time. We did talk through a few stats, but really, I mean, a lot of these stats, like Dan mentioned earlier, it's hard to know where they fit on the 1 to 10 scale. They could be, what I think is number 1, someone else could think is number 10 or even honorable mention. There's so many impressive stats in USF football history. My number 5 that I have is the Dusty Havorka career receiving yards, 4,801. Like you mentioned, so far ahead of the second place. Plus, Dusty, if you think about it, he doesn't have the single season record for receiving yards, which means that he actually was very consistent across his 4 years between the 1,100, 1,200 yard range, because to get 4,800 yards you have to average 1,200 yards over 4 seasons, and so he obviously did that without getting a super high total. So just consistency across the board with the number of yards he had and the total yards was just so much better than I think what anyone else we've seen.
I believe he had 1,000 yards all 4 years.
He did. Yeah, he did.
And that's again a first in school history. So, like I said at the outset, 1 through 10 could be the 10th could be 1, and so on. And that's certainly he was a dominating receiver.
Yeah, he actually had 11. His lowest touchdown total was 11 too. So he had quite a few touchdowns in there too during that 4-year career.
What do you got it for?
Well, before we get there, I wanted to see if we got any comments over here on the side. This one here, DeCourcy said we better have a Darren Martina mention. So we did. We had Martina in the honorable mention earlier for the tackles for loss, and so hopefully when you watch the replay, you can catch up on that one. My number 4, one that you already mentioned, Dan, the consecutive PATs by Braden Weeking, that 162. You went through and told the story, so I won't have to say it. But just missing that first one in 2009. And then not missing again till November the next year is very, very impressive, and I don't think we'll ever see anyone come close to that again.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to mention Darren again here shortly on when I get to my number 4. Are we ready for that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, that's the defense of 2008, and I have, to me, that ranks as the best defense in school history. We've certainly had some great ones in 17 and again this year that ranked top 5 in Division II, so it's hard to compare them. But when you look at the numbers of that 08 team, they only allowed 206 yards rushing. They, in 14 games, that's 0.6 yards per carry, 14.7 yards per game. And what's interesting is they gave up 206 yards in total rushing and had 349 yards in losses. So that's really incredible. They had a defense that had 116 tackles for loss. Unfortunately, that's not the most in school history. 09 had 122. But talking about Darren Martina, he had 25 back in, I think it was 2001. And that was a team that had 101, I believe, that year. And so, what's interesting about that 08 team, they won a game 34-31 and yet only gave up 83 total points in the season. They had 7 shutouts. And what was it? they held 11 of their 14 opponents to 7 points or less, including those 7 shutouts. And what's interesting is they don't have the lowest number of points. That was the 67 team that only gave up 58 in 1967, but that averages out to 6.4 in total numbers. The average per game of 5.9 is the best. So so if you're saying what's the record there, I mean, I think the most difficult one, the one part of it is the rushing part of it, and those numbers they just stand out in my view.
All right.
And so I guess I go to number 3.
Correct.
This is really hard to put at number 3 because it certainly deserves number 1. But the total points by the 09 team of 775, 51.7 per game in 15 games when they won a national title, had those 105 TDs. That's just incredible. So there's something to be said about what lies ahead yet at 2-1.
Yeah. My number 3 record of all time, you already mentioned this one, the 85 touchdowns by David Ruder. I don't think, we'll see that anytime soon. 1995 to 1998, you mentioned the stats earlier, 73 rushing, so just spectacular numbers for David Ruder. My number 2 is the touchdown passes in a season by an individual, and that was 55 by Curtis Riggs in 1996. 55 touchdowns in one season is absolutely insane. I think at one point during that 96 season, Curtis, and Dan, you have the number probably in front of you. Curtis also set a record for the most consecutive pass completions or something like that without throwing an interception.
Yeah, 290, which set a national record at the time. And I'm remiss in not including that earlier. That's another one that easily could be there. It set a national record at the time, but his numbers were incredible in both 05 and 06. Or
and
95.
That broke Trent Dilfer's record at the time, and Trent Dilfer went on to an NFL career, and you still see him once in a while on ESPN. So
what I'm saying, Chad, and we said it at the outset, was you look at these records and you try to figure out what's a top 10, and then you start messing with it. And it's really difficult because so many of these are quality marks, and that should be top 10. But that just goes to show the strength of this program and its long legacy. Winners win, right?
Put that hashtag up there. Someone type that in. All right, so give us your number 2 and number 1 here, Dan.
Okay, number 2. This speaks to the strength of our program overall here at the University of Sioux Falls. They have 26 straight winning seasons. It's the 4th best across all divisions of the NCAA. As I started looking at this and I started thinking about that, and I'm going, we had 4 national champions during that run. We've had 4 teams make the Division II playoffs. I mean, and this was a run that started under Bob Young, a great, Coach Young, and he started this program and followed by Kalen DeBoer, and then of course Jed Stugart, and then John Anderson, and we've had great coaches. And so, to me, that's number 2, and number 1. I started looking at this again, and I just can't believe it. From 2007 to 2000. Actually, it was 2008 to 2010. We had 42 consecutive wins, and that to me is hard to break. At one point, this program had 40 consecutive conference wins that got broken in 05. That was also a decent mark, but this one, I mean, they were incredible. Undefeated in 08, undefeated in 09, and undefeated in 10, all the way up to the championship game where they lost 10-7. You talk about a great season. John Eastman threw 45 touchdown passes that year, and he was 10 behind Curtis Riggs, who did that in 1996. So certainly during that run, there was 2 champions and 1 runner-up finish.
That's what I have as my number one as well. Those consecutive wins. And actually, if you want to expand on that a little bit further, Dan, if you think about it, undefeated 2006, one loss 2007, and then the one loss in 2010. That's only 2 losses in
That's 69-2. That's a 69-2 mark, and that's a coach's record, right? Coach DeBoer's record. Speaking
well, he
of
coached. He didn't coach in 2010. He started in 2005.
Right.
So he had 3.
That's right. He was actually 67-3. Now I think about it, but yeah, you're right. My fault.
With that 5-year span.
But here's a quick note about those 3 teams that set that mark. They averaged, well, actually they scored 1,863 points for an average of 44.4 per game. They gave up 360 during that time span for 8.6 points per game. 44-8 over that span. They scored in 08, they had 511, 775 in 09, and then 577 in 2010. So incredible.
So a lot of us that have been around USF football for a long time, you were talking about that 2008 defense, and what was the total yardage that they gave up that season, Dan?
I might not have. I think it was 109.4 yards per game. I didn't write down that total number, but that 08 and 09 both led the nation. So that's incredible.
So this is a defensive stat that hopefully never gets touched. But the 2013 game at Southwest Minnesota State and Marshall, USF gave up 828 yards of offense to Southwest that day and still ended up winning. So that was a crazy game that's going on, getting discussed over here in the chat row, I guess, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah, Whit came up with one here on, right?
Consecutive wins is the one record the stat crew can't screw up. Write this down. We'll
try. Certainly.
Anything else from the gallery over here? I think we saw some. We did mention David Reuter earlier. David Reuter actually broke Walter Payton's NAIA touchdown record with that 85 total touchdowns. So that's a pretty impressive mark. Yeah,
Kelly, that's a good note. So there's all kinds of notes and incredible accomplishments. I want to put in a plug for our women's basketball team here shortly. People want to tune in to ESPN here beginning at 9:45 when they're going to be featured on his senior night, and that's an incredible recognition for our women's basketball program as well as the university. But this legacy of football that has just continued to be amazing. 20 conference titles and incredible number of wins and national championships and the beat goes on with this winner's win philosophy.
Yeah. Well, Dan, I really appreciate you joining us tonight. It was fun. Like I said, on the last broadcast, there's not a whole lot else going on right now, so we might as well get together and talk sports. So I appreciate you spending some time with us tonight, and thank you so much. And for everyone out there viewing, thank you for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you again in the near future.
Thanks for hosting, Chad.
All right. Bye, everyone.